Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Flins post-release analysis. Flins has now been out for 2 weeks as of recording this video, and I've been playing with him a lot. I went for him not on my main account, but on my relatively new account that focuses more on vertical investment. But one of the results of that is that I ended up going for him on an account where I don't really have anyone else. I have him, I have Mawika right now, that's kind of it. Which means whenever I play this account, I'm almost always playing him. So I've actually played him a decent amount more than a lot of the characters by the time their post-release comes around. And we've got a lot of things to talk about today. So as usual for the post-release, we go through the pre-release, talked about what we got right, what we got wrong, what we missed, and give some more or less finalized thoughts on Flins before the banner is over. I didn't really update anything about the in-depth guide. If I were to go and update it, I'd probably talk a little bit more about the downsides and upsides of using Sarah and the sucrose alternatives as well. I mean, I'll talk about my thoughts on those more defensive options in this video, but I just wanted to get that out of the way and let you guys know that I probably won't be updating the guide. Yeah, I'm actually kind of curious about this. Do let me know in the comments of this video, for those of you that looked at the guide, if this was something you found useful. Because it was kind of a pain in the ass to do, and if I do other guides in the future, I'm not gonna put the effort into doing it again unless people actually think it was useful. Looking at the actual numbers, the normal attacks are pretty pathetic. They're not like completely terrible, but they're not good either. And as we're gonna see later, they also scale with different stats than his main source of damage. So generally, those normal attacks are gonna tickle. They're gonna be less than 10% of your DPS. He also has a charge attack, but honestly, there's no real reason to use it. Like, it's possible that his best combos will include some charge attacks, because it's possible that the charge attack is better than just spamming normal attacks, but it'll kind of be like the difference between doing a normal attack on your Bennett because you're on swap cooldown. So the charge attack is pretty much worthless. Yeah. Technically, there is a case where it does that has been found after his release. Let's talk about hit lag for a second. Whenever you hit an enemy with an attack, your characters and the enemy's movement and animations get paused for a very short window of time when your attacks collide with enemies. The purpose of hit lag is to make it so that attacks that feel like they should go through the enemy feel more smoothly than attacks that feel like they should generate an impact. Claymore attacks are using bigger weapons, so they tend to have longer hit lag. This is to make heavier attacks feel heavier, basically. The thing is, your character's animation and the enemy's animations are not the only things that get paused by hit lag. Pretty much anything that either has an animation time or a timer will either be affected by hit lag or not. And, well, there's some things that are and some things that aren't. Why does this matter for Flins? For Flins, the amount of time his Manifest Flame, his skill, lasts is affected by hit lag. In other words, the more you collide with enemies with your attacks, the longer your Manifest Flame can last. Now, by default, Manifest Flame lasts for 10 seconds, and the Northland Spear Storm, the like additional special skill, has a 6-second cooldown. So if you use the first one at the very beginning, and the second one as soon as it's available, 6 seconds later, by the time your Manifest Flame, your skill stance is over, you'll still have a 2-second cooldown left on the Northland Spear Storm, on the special skill. Let's show that. Actually, I can't show that because I'm at C1, but it's fine. We can show the amount of time left. So 5 point something, right? It was basically 6 seconds, 5.9, whatever. And so it's pretty clear that it lasted 10 seconds. But when I start hitting, if we look at the cooldown left when the skill expires, it's actually 5, not 5.9. If you somehow manage to generate enough hit lag, it can actually be possible for Flins to get a third Northland Spear Storm before his skill is over. In order to do that, you need to generate 2 seconds worth of hit lag though, which is very difficult. His best combo hit lag wise is generally N3 and then either dash or burst based on whether you have the mini bursts that you need to do or not. So you want to spam N3, and in order to get enough hit lag generation to make your Manifest Flame last long enough for 3 Northland Spear Storms, you need to get 8 N3 combos. I think it's fine if you get like 7 N3s and 1 N2, just barely, but it's basically 8. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do it as fast as I can, and we're gonna count the amount I'm getting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and as you can see, the stance expired basically right as I was finishing my 7th. For the sake of showing this, the skill cooldown didn't actually matter, so the C1 didn't change anything, but that's because I didn't use the skill off cooldown. Yeah, I guess we can showcase it in the trial as well. 1, 2, 3, kind of 4, but not really. 5, 6, 7, 8. But as you can see, the skill expired before I was really there. I also dash canceled too early on one of my hits. Getting this amount of hits in practice is borderline impossible. I believe it is doable if you're frame perfect on every cancel. I don't know if it's doable at 60 FPS or if you need to intentionally change your FPS to 30. I think it's frame perfect at 60 and you have 1 frame of wiggle room at 30 or something. I'm not sure. It's kind of cooked, basically. Now, because what you need to happen is have effectively 8 times 3, 24 instances of hit lag. And that's what the requirement is to get a 3rd special skill and therefore a 3rd mini burst. Hit lag is not affected by attack speed, which means that if you get attack speed, getting 24 attacks, getting 24 instances of hit lag will be easier. This is why you might have seen some people doing this combo with Skyward Spine. If you are good enough to get this combo reliably with Skyward Spine, it makes Skyward Spine a better weapon. Not on the same level as Sig, but it does bridge the gap to some extent. However, I think even with Skyward Spine, this is incredibly inconsistent. The biggest problem is, 1, sometimes enemies move, and if an enemy dashes backwards and your attack doesn't connect with them, you don't get the hit lag from it, and now you're cooked. 2, if you have to dash at a time that isn't one of the specified, like, frame perfect dashes that you have to do, you're cooked. Now, because there are no good characters for Flins' teams that actually provide attack speed, in my opinion, this combo is effectively not something that matters. I don't think it's consistent enough to justify getting an attack speed giver just for this. And even if you did, the attack speed givers are so much worse in terms of provided stats that it's not worth it. I've seen a lot of people talk about Jean. Jean C2 gives attack speed. The reason why you would put Jean on your team by default is like healer, but mainly VV. But VV lasts 10 seconds, and the 3rd mini burst will happen 12 seconds, bit more than 12 seconds after you swap to Flins. Which means it's kind of just gonna tickle the enemies, and it's barely gonna be a damage upgrade even if it does happen. One thing I want to talk about though is damage percent on Flins in general. Damage percent is not good on him, but it's not completely worthless. It's just that it's obviously a lot less good than his other stats. When it comes to damage percent for Flins, it's a lot worse than his other stats, but if there's something that gives him a ton of it, it'll be better than an alternative that gives a small amount of a stat he likes more. Basically, this is about Chilonen and like Auroron and using Cinder City on them. Cinder City on them is actually generally pretty similar to the alternatives, despite the stat being a lot less useful, just because it gives a ton of it, right? 40% is big. Cinder City is not a balanced set. It has a 6-second cooldown, and the stance change lasts for 10 seconds, which means that you will only be able to fit 2 special skills inside the stance. That being said, you have a bit of flexibility on when exactly, right? Because if you use it at the very start, 6 seconds later, the cooldown will be over, and you'll have 4 seconds remaining to your skill stance. So you can either use it immediately or wait a little bit. That does mean that he's not going to be particularly vulnerable to things that will interrupt him. He's not going to be too reliant on defensive utility. Okay, that is true, but you guys f***ing suck at the game. The amount of screenshots I've seen of people in Overworld with a dead Flins on their team is insane. It's probably the character who's died the most after their release in the game. I don't know what you guys are doing. His base gameplay loop, you use your skill to enter your manifest flame form. Then you have 10 seconds during which you need to fit 2 special skills followed by mini bursts. Once you've unleashed your second mini burst, you don't need to stay on Flins for any longer than that. However, Flins' particle generation is tied to the electro-infused normal attacks. So swapping out early is generally not ideal. Okay, so let's talk about the particle generation a little bit. In the default combos that are like technically the best for him, let's count our particles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 particles. But most people don't actually get 5 particles. Most people open up like this and then start hitting. We get 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's it. The reason for that is because your particle generation is tied to normal attacks, but it has a cooldown to it. Which means, in order to generate the optimal amount of energy, you always want to start with skill normal to generate your first particle before you use your first Northwind Spear Storm. This is effectively just +1 particle versus if you didn't do this. This is something that is most definitely worth doing, and if you're not doing this, this is a great way of making Flins feel better. Because Flins is a character whose damage is directly tied to his burst, so increasing his energy generation by 1 whole particle is a big deal. That being said, if we look at the timer, when we do a full rotation with his default premium team, so we'll open our rotation at 55.
Cleanup sequence initiated. Ultimatum protocol.
Observe. Be silent. Night falls. Close your eyes. Night falls.
And if I keep hitting until my skill stance is over and then I swap out at 37, which is 18 seconds later. Flins' skill cooldown, and I think that's something I start talking about a bit later on in the video, is 16 seconds. And in a perfect world, that's what you want to build his rotations around. Because of that, it's generally recommended to swap out of Flins before his skill actually expires. If we were to try to show a full proper rotation, it looks something like this. We'll start at 55 again.
Defensive mode engaged. Annihilation mode.
Observe. Close your eyes. Fear the dark. To dust.
And we swap out something like this. I swapped out about a second early there, but it's much better to swap out a little early than it is to swap out a little late.
Be silent.
Here I'm not doing a proper rotation, but it's fine.
Observe. Do you fear the dark?
Because if you swap out a little early, you're basically missing out on 1 particle. If you swap out a little late, you're slowing down your rotation by 1 to 2 seconds, and that tends to be a much bigger DPS loss. Optimized Flins gameplay generally will end up swapping out at the right moment, and like if you're really good at Flins, you'll consistently get 4 particles, but I think a lot of people will get 3 most of the time. This means that his practical ER requirements are often going to be higher than what I've talked about in the guide. If we assume all 5 of the possible particles from his skill, a 16-second rotation where Ineffa will hit 8 times, with 5 of those while Flins is on field, each time is 2/3 of a particle on average, and 3 of those when he's not. And then we also have 3 instances of Electro Resonance proccing, 2 when Flins is on field, 1 when he is not. We've got Sucrose particles, which after the first rotation is only 1 set of particles, right? You can get 2 sets from the first one, but after that it's only 1. They're batteried into Flins, which is nice for his energy. Then we have Ino particles. If she's on Fav, you can also get an extra set of particles from that, which gives you a fairly optimistic ER requirements of around 120. I think in practice, for most people, what's gonna happen is they will get 4 instead of 5 on average, which makes the actual ER requirement a little bit closer to 130. This is with pretty good gameplay. But if you're not paying attention to your energy requirements, you'll often only get 3 instances of particle generation from Flins. It's also very possible that you don't properly battery your particles from Sucrose and you don't end up catching them with him, which can increase your ER requirements to upwards of like over 140. If you're not using Fav on Ino, which I know a lot of people aren't, in Siege and Onslaught, because you start with no energy, unless you have something that can front load particle generation into Ino, it's actually difficult for her to burst at the very start of the first rotation, like you kind of want her to. And so a lot of people end up using Flame-Forged Insight instead of Fav, just so that they can get this front-loaded particle or energy generation from R5 giving you 24 energy, which is half of her burst cost already. But if you're also not using Fav on Ino, your requirements are now like over 150. I've seen a lot of people say that they have had better results with ER Sands on Flins than attack Sands, even people who don't use the big burst. This is because with your gameplay, you're not getting all of the particles that are possible to get, which means that on your default attack Sands build, you don't have enough energy to do both of your mini bursts. And you end up doing, at like 120% ER, you end up generating about 46 energy per rotation, which is 1.5 mini bursts per rotation. That is a major DPS loss. In Siege and Onslaught specifically, this enemy has 3 layers of shields, and every time you break a layer of shield, he floods you with electro particles. Okay, so let's take a look at what happens when I use burst and break the first layer of the shield, or 2 layers of shield. Look at all this energy I just got from this shit. It's a lot of energy. So for this Siege and Onslaught, having ER requirements that are a bit too low won't affect you too much. But as soon as we get an enemy that isn't just flooding you with electro particles, you'll start feeling it, and you'll feel it a lot. This is a major problem. Flins' damage is pretty much almost entirely coming from his mini burst, right? 70% of it is from the mini burst, which means that if you get 1 mini burst instead of 2, bam, you just lost like more than 1/3 of your damage. That's the equivalent of the difference between C0 Flins and like C3 Flins. For people that have Sig, they won't tend to encounter this as often because generally the ER requirements with Sig, right? Sig is 48 flat energy, so it basically just reduces the cost. Even if things go wrong, 124 isn't too high, so most people accidentally have this much already. But that doesn't mean that it's a problem that gets fixed by Sig. It's a pitfall that is easy to avoid that doesn't exist with Sig. But it's still easy to avoid without Sig, okay? This is not me saying you need Sig to fix this problem. I want to make that very clear. The big burst is just a mini burst, but worse. Yeah, like let's actually properly show what I mean with this. We're gonna do a full proper setup and look at the damage the burst does on... Oh, please. Please. Okay, thank you.
Stand clear.
Observe. Fear the dark. Fear the dark.
Okay. So, we're gonna wait out our cooldowns properly.
The long sleep beckons.
Right? A bunch of 20Ks and then 40Ks followed by a f***ing...
Fear the dark.
like 300K? A little bit south of 500K total. And then the mini burst also did a little bit south of 500K total. Except the big burst costs 2.666 times more, and it has a much longer animation. Like when I say the big burst is just a bad mini burst, I mean it. It's the same damage for more energy and a longer animation. It's just bad. Yeah, that's without accounting for how often it misses because the enemy decided to move a little bit. And so, unlike Varesa, Flins actually has many different situations where he wants to use his big burst. Do keep in mind, your big burst is effectively just the equivalent of 1 more mini burst, so if using your big burst prevents you from doing a mini burst, it is not worth using. Yeah, so I just want to like clarify that a little bit more, right? You should only ever use the big burst when you are certain that it will not cost you a mini burst. Because like I showed you earlier, right? It does basically the same damage as a mini burst, but it costs me more energy, and also, and honestly, more importantly, and not more importantly, but also very importantly, because of the long animation, you also generate less energy. So it actually costs even more energy than you'd think. Okay, yeah, we can actually show now what the rotation that uses the big burst looks like. In order to make sure we have the energy for it, we're gonna go 5. Okay. So.
Installation chamber deployed. Annihilation mode. Stand clear.
Beware the creatures of the night. Close your eyes. To dust.
And then I'll wait 2 more seconds after my skill is over to simulate C0, and it looks something like this. Now, if you were paying close attention, you may have noticed I did not do QE on Flins. Let's see what happens if I do QE.
Annihilation mode. Q on this. Animal test 6308.
Beware the creatures of the night. Be silent. Close your eyes. Night falls.
Alright, I'll wait an extra 2 seconds.
Silent. Fear the
Okay.
dark.
Then I swap.
Cleanup sequence initiated. Absorption test.
And again, we have like 2 seconds left. You know why we have 2 seconds left? We have 2 seconds left because our burst animation is 2 seconds and we used our burst before the skill. Now, using the Northland Spear Storm transforms our burst into the mini burst. But using the stance change effect does not. This means that what is technically the optimal combo for the big burst rotation is gonna be Flins, E and 1 burst,
Long sleep Bennett.
E,
Silent.
and then you start hitting,
Fear the dark.
and then you'll use the second skill when it's back off cooldown,
Fear the
and then you keep going.
Mode engaged. Ultimatum protocol.
The E N1 burst is for what we talked about with using the N1 right after your first skill for the additional particle that generates, especially in the rotations where you are trying to do this big burst combo. You absolutely need to maximize your particle generation. If your particle generation isn't high, you won't be able to generate 60 energy from 0 after the big burst. And if you don't generate 60 energy from 0 after the big burst, congrats! You just lost a mini burst to get a big burst, and it was basically a DPS loss. Unless you're playing against an enemy that drops a ton of particles like the Fatui, in my opinion, it is outright necessary to do the N1 before the big burst. If you're not doing the N1 before the big burst, your ER requirements to get the second mini burst in a timely manner that won't extend your rotation are just too high for it to be worth it. Also keep in mind, it's not just about getting the second mini burst, getting that 60 full energy before the skill duration expires, it's also before your buffs expire. We've already seen that the actual duration of this is more than 10 seconds. That means that your 10-second duration buffs actually expire before this does. So your VV, but also your buffs that last less than 10 seconds, like Sucrose's EM bonus, which is 8 seconds. It's very, very easy to end up missing this buff on the last mini burst when you do the big buff rotation. The actual ER requirements for this to be worth doing tends to be a lot higher than I think most people realize. Your ER requirement is now over 220 instead of this 176 that we talked about in the pre-release. It's technically still possible to do the rotation at 176, but your second mini burst is going to lose a lot of the buffs and your rotation will be longer, so I don't actually think it's all that worthwhile. This is kind of saved if you use Fav, by the way, because with Fav R5, it's now 153. It's also not too bad with Sig at 177. This with an ER Sans is doable, but with Sig, you have a different problem. If you do EN1Q, you might trigger a lunar charge reaction before you Q, and if you do, you generate the energy before you consume it on burst and you're cooked, which means you're actually forced to open with Q instead of E, which can extend your rotations as well, unless you swap to Flins while his skill is on cooldown. You gotta keep track of that. All those things together mean that in practice, unless you're on Fav or engulfing, I would generally not try to do the big burst rotation. That being said, this is just as a general rule, but there are going to be enemies that drop a big amount of energy at certain thresholds, like the Fatui that drops a bunch of electro particles. Another good example is actually in the current Abyss, we have Triple Kenki. They drop a lot of particles. But yeah, so when you're against enemies that you know give you a ton of energy, you can use this even on low ER builds. Yeah, we can skip to the end of weapons. It's a bit hard for me to be certain about whether Fav is better or worse than Deathmatch and Fjords because of the current content. It just gives you so much energy that it doesn't feel like the Fav is all that impactful. But that's just because the current content does that. So Fav is either slightly better than these or slightly worse, but it's pretty close. But I mean, like I talked about in the pre-release video about Fav, you shouldn't put Fav on Flins because, well, while it is a good weapon for him, it's a good weapon on every full arm user in the game. You probably need multiple Favs on other characters. And if you have enough copies of Fav that you can afford to put one on Flins, it's probably either because you're an incredibly long-time player and you've got a Jadewing Spear lying around, or because you pull on the weapon banner and you've got another 5-star stat stick you can use on him. And those tend to be better than Fav. Next, artifact sets. Outside of the signature set, TF actually will be your next best option. Yeah, so this was a good read on my part. TF is indeed generally his second best set. There's a clear out there of someone who did C0 or 0 Flins without Ineffa in Dire. They do use some like 5-star stat sticks that aren't signature weapons, but that clear is enabled by TF with Fischl. Sugos, I know TF allows you to do reliable 13.5 second rotations, and because TF has been in the game for a long time, they have a really good TF set, and so it ended up just straight up performing noticeably better than his SIG set for them. That doesn't mean you should go and farm TF, right? This is for people that already have a TF farmed. If you are about to farm something for him, farm his signature set. But it's just something that's kind of good to know. Yeah, okay, also one thing I want to say, if your build looks like this and the content isn't dropping a lot of particles for you, you're probably not going to be able to do a reliable 2 bursts per rotation. And so it is very, very possible that you'll straight up get faster clears with an ER Sans, even if it goes way over the actual amount of ER you need. This is what I was talking about towards the beginning when I was talking about people seeing better results with an ER Sans. It's just because of the breakpoint. It gets you to that breakpoint, and that's a big deal. That being said, another way to get you to a breakpoint is to put Fav on Ineffa. A lot of people forget that's a thing you can do. Just in terms of DPS, Fav doesn't actually tend to be better than non-energy weapons for Ineffa for the team DPS. However, the fact that Fav exists and is something you can put on Ineffa means that if you have a build like this that has really good crit stats, and your only way to get like the 10% more ER you need to really fulfill those ER requirements is by losing a lot of damage, losing a lot of crit stats for that ER, it's probably better to just go Fav on Ineffa. And finally, his teams. Flins only really has one team. He is an energy-reliant carry, so he really wants to be played with another Electro character, and half of his kit just straight up doesn't work if you don't have a Hydro character on the team to trigger Lunar Charge, which doesn't leave you that much flexibility for the last slot. Generally, that last slot is just going to be a buffer, right? So instead of looking at teams individually, we're just going to assume you're doing his one team, and you have the Electro characters, you have the Hydro characters, and you have the buffers. Ineffa is his best support. She's the support that is the most important to his teams. If you don't have Ineffa, your next best option is like 20% behind. And it's a pretty noticeable difference. Something I don't think I actually mentioned in the Ineffa section here. Your next best option that's 20% behind doesn't give you defensive utility. Your next best option that gives you defensive utility is 30% behind. A bit more than that, actually. So if you're not someone who thinks they can get away with, like, no healing, not having Ineffa is gonna gimp you a lot. Next is Iansan. With Iansan, Flins is not a character that moves a lot. However, we've talked about how pathetic his normal attack damage is. What that means is that if you want to just run around like a headless chicken, keep your Nightfall up in between the normal attacks that you do to generate energy every 2 seconds, you can, and you don't really lose any damage. Let's actually show that. Let's keep in mind that it doesn't benefit a lot from damage percent, so we don't need to like fill up the Night Soul bar for Iansan C6.
Close your eyes. Night falls. Observe.
Alright, so if you don't move too much,
Be silent.
as you can see, he isn't Night Soul positive
Steady now.
for Iansan, but he doesn't lose that much.
Observe. Be silent. Night.
Right, but as long as we just input a couple dashes in between our things,
Observe.
we maintain our Night Soul pretty full, and it's not much of a problem. As long as we stay above 42 Night Soul on Iansan, we still have the full attack buff. That's affected obviously by Iansan cons, Iansan C4 mainly, but yeah. Next, Electro MC. If you don't have Ineffa, Electro MC is your next best option. Electro MC is a character that gives you a lot of energy. Let's take a look at ER requirements for burst every other rotation on Flins. Okay, honestly, I'm just gonna skip this whole thing. If you're able to play those Electro MC rotations well with Flins, I will build a shrine in your honor. You're the GOAT of Genshin Impact. It's a sort of team that's like technically not a bad team, but I can't play it, you can't play it, stop lying to yourself, let's move on. Then you have the other alternatives. Mainly, you're thinking about the healers, Kuki or Dori, but it's mainly Kuki. You don't really want to use Kuki. You'd rather use a healer on a different slot. Yeah, one thing I didn't mention here that I definitely should have. You don't want to use Kuki. Using Kuki feels like shit. But if you don't have Ineffa, you need someone to activate Ascendant Gleam, so you can't use a healer on your Hydro slot. And your defensive options on the buff slot kind of suck about as much as Kuki does. So using Kuki is probably like a reasonable option for people that don't have Ineffa. Yeah, honestly, we can kind of just skip this whole thing, right, and just talk about all of them. All of those Hydro options are very usable. If you have Ineffa, you can just pretty much put any of them, and the difference will be pretty minor. Because none of them provide something that's... The only characters that provide something that's anywhere close to meaningful extend your rotations, and it basically, like, cancels out that meaningful buff. Yeah, you can use Kokumi, you can use Barba, you can use Sijuin. Use your favorite bad Hydro character that you want to play but never feels good, because they'll feel fine here. Next is Bennett. Bennett is also okay, pretty similar to Shilonen. It's a little bit worse. If you don't have Ineffa, right, and you're forced into using Aino, like Shilonen with a damage Electro option is pretty similar to Kuki with Sucrose. It's alright. But if you end up getting shred somehow, either because you're against an enemy that has negative resistances, for example, the Cactus. Okay, actually, let's talk about this. There was a tweet about people arguing about the best option for nuke Flins, and someone was getting much better results with Bennett than they were with Sucrose. The reason for that was because the target against which they were doing their nuke was the Cactus. The way that the Cactus works is, like, it starts with a hot phase, it shuffles around, then it's got a shield, and you can Lunar Charge or deal Electro or Hydro damage to break the shield. Once the shield gets broken, it gets stunned for like 10, 15, I don't remember how many, and while it's stunned, its resistance is minus 90%. Because it starts with resistance so low, the shred from VV becomes incredibly diluted. And then if you just look at the comparatively much smaller amount of shred you're getting in that case, plus Sucrose's EM and attack buff, it's actually less than what Bennett will give you. Alright, so this is something I talked about here, where like if you have shred from other sources, if you have like Flins C2 for example, there can be situations where Bennett is better. And I mean, yeah, there can. Bennett can be alright, but not noticeably so, and just put the Sucrose in the bag, little bro. All in all, Flins has some pretty good constellations, all things considered. His C1 and 2 are fairly good. 3 and 4 are like pretty whatever. 5 is pathetic, and 6 is pretty good. But he's a character that's gonna feel kind of like Molani in that the early constellations can increase his damage by quite a bit. Not by quite as much as Molani, but it's a similar idea. That being said, he's honestly good enough at C0, so the constellations are far from necessary. One thing I want to, like, not necessarily, like, correct, but I guess correct here, is, like, it's kind of similar to Molani, but it's, like, each individual thing is, like, 5% less than Molani. So, like, the increase from C2R1 for Flins is noticeable amount less than the increase from Molani. If you compare him to the early Natlan characters, he is better. But if you compare him to the late Natlan characters, he's as good or worse. Everything considered, his premium teams deal a very similar amount of DPS as Varesa's premium teams. He's just about as strong overall. That's wrong. People have min-maxed Varesa teams much more since this. I mean, I'm sure there were people already doing the better combos beforehand, but I have learned about them since then at the very least. And unfortunately, Varesa kind of solos this fraud. It is what it is. I'm sorry. That being said, it's not really Varesa findings, it's Maoika findings and combo optimization on Maoika, which means that it only affects the Varesa teams that use Maoika. And one of the upsides of Varesa is that she's got some pretty strong teams where she's the only 5-star, and those teams don't get brought up the same way that the Maoika teams do. Well, just take that with a grain of salt. But yeah, all in all, Flins, looking fairly interesting. I'm pretty excited. As usual, I hope you learned a thing or two. Anyways, we still don't have any real reliable information / leaks on Columbina. so I can't really speak to that yet. In terms of like how he performs compared to how I expected, I'd say he's pretty much exactly where I expected him to be. I would be a little bit careful evaluating his performance based on his performance in current content. Remember, this content is shilling him very heavily. This enemy, the shield phase, gives you 200% increased lunar charge damage. It also stops regenerating its shield basically if you're triggering lunar charge or electro charge. It also has higher resistance to every element except electro during the shield. It also has negative electro resistance after the shield. It also drops, I think it's 12. There's 3 sets of, I think, 4, might be 5 electro particles, which basically make you start with an extra 40-something energy, but you also get that again the second time he shields up. I don't think there's an enemy that's been as shilled against something as Flins is being shilled against this boss. Yeah, I guess maybe Llama with the crab. This patch is very, very, very heavy shill, basically. And the shill is not likely to stop until we get to the end of Non-Cry. But that means that as soon as something else starts getting shilled, it's gonna feel like his performance is going to tank, because his actual true performance will come out. So just be careful about that. Like, if you want to get him, I'm not trying to say like you're not allowed to. Bad. His haircut is ugly as hell, but that's not the point of this video. I'm just trying to remind you that they are trying to sell him, and he is being heavily shilled in order for it to be easier to sell him right now. So keep that in the back of your head when you're making your decision of whether or not you want to go for him. That's pretty much it for the pre-release, or for the post-release. Overall, I've been having a decent amount of fun with Flins. I didn't go for him on main like I said at the start, but I did go for him on this account. I don't really regret it. I think it was an acceptable decision going for the Ineffa Flins core. I will say he is not nearly as fun as Varesa. Varesa's rotation optimization is so fun. Flins doesn't have that, but that's not necessarily a downside. It's a downside for me, but it also has an associated upside, which is that easy to get a performance that's close to his sheet DPS. If you're someone who sucks at games, but you still enjoy them, Flins is the sort of character that won't really punish you for skill issue, basically. Anyways, like I said, hope you enjoyed, hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.